And thank you so much for coming to this very important event. I'd like to just quickly introduce our esteemed moderator, DORCHEN LEIDHOLDT, who's a leader in the fight against sex trafficking. She helped to found the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women in 1988, and she currently chairs the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition. DORCHEN is also the director of Sanctuary's Center for Battered Women's Legal Services, where she works as an advocate and as an agent of change through both litigation and legislation. We are very fortunate to have her moderating this dynamic group of women today, who all have a phenomenal amount of knowledge and passion in the area of domestic sex trafficking. With that, I'll turn things over to DORCHEN.
Thank you so very much. The title of tonight's panel is In Our Own Backyards, a conversation about domestic sex trafficking in the United States and in New York. I am so very grateful to our sponsor, the Task Force for Women in the Courts Committee, its chair, Rebecca Burkbile, and Alexandra Keeling and Flor Blaze Williams, who played key roles in organizing tonight's event. When most people think of sex trafficking in the United States, they think of immigrant women and girls tricked or abducted by organized crime rings, traffickers from Eastern Europe or Asia, and forced into prostitution. They think of international sex trafficking. They don't think of women and girls and boys and men and transgender people, primarily of color, who are born and raised in our own communities, whose exploiters are typically men, but sometimes women from our own communities. They don't think of trafficking when the principal tactics employed by the exploiters are seduction and manipulation, preying on a young person's position of vulnerability, poverty, history of sexual abuse, absence of family support, homelessness, or discrimination because that person is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or otherwise gender nonconforming. Make no mistake, trafficking is an egregious violation of fundamental human rights, regardless of the victim's background. But consider this statistic. The State Department estimates that approximately 17,000 people are trafficked into the United States across international borders. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children estimates that 100,000 children are being subjected to commercial sexual exploitation, and children being subjected to commercial sexual exploitation is within the meaning of our federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act, child trafficking. There is no reliable estimate that I am aware of the number of adults whose trafficking starts and continues in our own backyards, but we know from our work that there are many. Isn't it high time then that we turned our attention to them, to provide protection and services, to hold their exploiters accountable, and perhaps most important, to prevent the exploitation and abuse in the first place? I am so delighted that we have such a distinguished group, a distinguished and knowledgeable group of panelists, and I will start from your left. Taina Biana May is the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. The Coalition Against Trafficking in Women is the first and oldest international non-governmental organization dedicated to ending trafficking in women and girls and related forms of commercial sexual exploitation as forms of gender-based violence. And to my immediate right, Jane Beagleson is the Director of External Affairs and Anti-Human Trafficking Initiatives at Covenant House, New York, the nation's largest adolescent care agency serving homeless, runaway, and at-risk youth. To my far left is Carol Smolinski. Carol is the executive director of ECPAT USA. ECPAT stands for End Child Prostitution and Trafficking. ECPAT USA is the U.S. branch of the ECPAT International Network, with headquarters in Thailand and affiliate organizations in 73 countries. ECPAT works to end all forms of the commercial sexual exploitation of children. And to my immediate left is Lauren Hirsch. Lauren is the New York Director of Equality Now, an international human rights organization that works to protect and promote the rights of women and girls around the world. And I'll start with a question that will give our panelists an opportunity to talk a little bit about their organizations and their work on human trafficking. There's a global movement to end sex trafficking. How does your organization fit in? And Carol, would you like to start?
Sure. So, thank you, DORCHEN, and good evening, everyone. It's really nice to see such a nice turnout on such a miserable night. I'll say a few words about ECPAT. ECPAT started in 1991, aimed at ending sex tourism in Asia. It was started by Asian children's rights activists who recognized large numbers of children being used and abused in the sex trade, partly to meet the demand coming from foreigners traveling to Asia to exploit children there. They put the issue on the map with a research report in 4 countries, and that's when ECPAT USA got its start. The Asians went around the world, said to children's rights and other interested people in our countries, your men are coming to our countries to exploit our children. They're being sold and abused to your men as buyers. This has got to stop. So we started an ECPAT group in the United States to work on that. Over the years, ECPAT grew and expanded its mission quite rapidly, so that now we're in 72 countries, as DORCHEN mentioned. And what we work on is policy mainly and legislation around ending all forms of commercial sexual exploitation of children, trafficking, prostitution, pornography, in all of the countries that we work in. So I'm from ECPAT USA, and what we work on mainly is federal policy and legislation here. We work on some state policy and legislation in New York in particular right now. We do a lot of work with the private sector, with the travel industry, which I hope to get an opportunity to talk to you about. And we do a lot of awareness raising. And let me just take one more minute to talk about children who are sexually exploited. Because in the general population and in the world, people understand young children who are used and sold for sex are seen as poor, innocent victims who need help and protection. Unfortunately, I have noticed over the years that that understanding and that consensus that those children are entitled to help and protection kind of stops when a girl or boy reaches the age of puberty. So around 11 or 12 or 13, suddenly those boys and girls are mixed in with an adult sex trade, this big market for bodies. And suddenly, they're not seen so much as sympathetic victims anymore, but more people in this trade that's kind of conceived as a victimless crime. It's prostitution, the oldest, profession, people say. And so a lot of our work has been in the United States around changing that paradigm about who these kids are and that they're entitled to protection.
Thank you so much, Carol. Lauren, what is Equality Now doing to end sex trafficking globally, but with a focus on in the United States as well?
Sure. Thanks so much, DORCHEN. Good evening, everybody. Before we move on to Equality Now, I kind of want to piggyback on what Carol was just saying about children and just take a moment to say that we also see that when children turn 18, we often are treating we're seeing that those young women are being treated as victims. And what happens in actuality is if the average age of entry for a child into prostitution is 12 to 14 years old, which is pretty consistent with my personal experience of working on these cases, then what we see when a person turns 18 is that very frequently they have been victimized from the time that they were a child. And so I just wanted to sort of take the opportunity to say that one of the things that we focus on at Equality Now is obviously the exploitation, the commercial sexual exploitation of children, but also of women. And we recognize that men and boys are also victims of trafficking. So with that, I'll circle back to Equality Now. Equality Now is a global human rights organization that combats violence and discrimination against women and girls worldwide. And the way that we work is we work with grassroots partners all over the world. And our way of working is really to listen to those grassroots partners and try to take their lead on what they need. And so we work in 4 different program areas. One of the program areas that I head up is the sex trafficking program. And we advocate on the international, national, and local level. And with the focus on really changing the paradigm and ultimately preventing sex trafficking. And when we think about sex trafficking prevention, Equality Now's position is that the most effective strategy for prevention is to focus on the demand for commercial sex. Because where there's no demand, where there's no buyer, there's no business. Where there's no business, there's no sex trafficking. And so I was recently in a class with young people, and we were talking about the notion of supply and demand, and instantly they understood that if there's no demand, then there's no supply. And so our focus at Equality Now is ending the demand for commercial sex and really following the lead from Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, who are criminalizing sex buyers and traffickers and decriminalizing people in prostitution. And we've seen that this is a tremendously effective strategy.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Taina, could you tell us a little bit about what the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women is doing to combat sex trafficking?
Sure. Thank you, DORCHEN, and thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. This is exciting. I know in the programs it says that I'm the executive director of the Women's City Club, but as of January 6th, I am with the Coalition, CATW, for those of you who like acronyms. And, just echoing and leaping from what Carol and Lauren was saying, I was a founding board member of Equality Now in the early 90s, which seems like a million years ago. And it was at a time when women's rights were not considered human rights. And look what a movement can do 20 years later. So that's wonderful. And so the areas that we focused on, as Lauren says, was just general violence and discrimination against women and girls, discriminatory laws, and harmful cultural practices. And we based our work on sex trafficking, on CATW's work and vision, who had already been in place 4 years before, and who really had, and DORCHEN is one of the co-founders, an amazing vision of, and obviously it didn't initiate with DORCHEN, who was obviously inspired by centuries of philosophers and activists and abolitionists thinking about what it is to be a human being, and are women part of the environment of human beings. And it's a question that you may think is redundant, but in fact it's not, because when we talk about exploitation in the sex trade, when we talk about this occupation that is the sex trade, and we talk about prostitution, but it's a broad spectrum that can range from lap dance establishments to sex slavery and everything in between. When you look at the populations, as Lauren and DORCHEN have said, it is the most vulnerable people on the planet, whether it's in the United States or everywhere. So looking at that, looking at this concept of inequality, what the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women is doing is really, in its name, really building a movement at a national, regional, and international level to ensure that the laws that are in place nationally and internationally reflect sort of the gender inequality that we still face. And in terms of trafficking, and specifically, we want to ensure that governments who have signed the Palermo Protocol really adopt that broad definition of abuse of power and taking advantage of people in positions of vulnerability, and also that consent is never a defense. And second part is, legislative advocacy also at the national and regional and international level to ensure that the market dries up, right? The market of supply and demand, so that the demand does dry up and that people understand that exploitation in the sex trade is our harmful cultural practice. And thirdly, we also are investing, supporting, and highlighting the work of the growing survivor community, where now you have survivors from the sex trade who are bold enough, brave enough, brilliant enough to come forth and tell their stories, which is really key in developing policy and also changing our own culture and understanding of what exploitation in the sex trade is.
Thank you. And Jane, tell us about the work of Covenant House.
Sure. So I work at Covenant House, New York, and Covenant House is part of an international agency where we work with homeless youth in the US, Latin America, and Canada. Actually, in Latin America, we have 2 houses specifically for trafficked and sexually exploited young girls. I, though, work in Covenant House, New York, not very far away from here, where we sleep over 300 homeless young people a night and serve about 3,000 a year. And these are homeless kids aged 16 to 20. In the US, we focus on that age group because, I should say a majority of our kids are 18 and 19, because that's the age where a lot of them are signing themselves out of foster care, or their family thinks that they're old enough to kick them out on their home. So in the US, that's the age that we focus on. We offer all sorts of wraparound services, everything from the basics, things like a shower, laundry, a bed, the things that most of us take for granted, to much more than that. Casework, medical care, legal care, I'm in the legal department, mental health care, job training and education. So as you can see, I'm probably the one agency represented that's not a trafficking organization per se. We serve homeless youth. But the reason that I'm here tonight is because the pimps and the traffickers prey on our kids. So even though we don't, are not necessarily a trafficking agency, we need to be doing something about trafficking, because homeless young people are the #1 targets of pimps and traffickers. And sadly, we've known that for a very long time. I think before we even knew that we were supposed to call it trafficking, we're right near Times Square. We know that the pimps are after our kids. And in fact, I'm going to talk about it more later, but one of the things I was brought on to do was to develop some trafficking programming for our young people. And the first thing I needed to figure out was, well, how many of our young people had experienced this? And it was really difficult to find that out. And that's because the young people don't arrive on our doorstep saying, help me, I've been trafficked. And if you ask them, and we did try to ask them, you can't say, have you been trafficked? You can't, they're going to look at you like you're nuts. Instead, they come saying, help me, I'm hungry, I need a bed. So we need to come up with a way to better identify them. So I'm going to talk a little later about a study that we did at Covenant House. But I'll give you the one main finding now, which is that we spoke to 200 young people, and out of 200 young people, 15% had experiences that fit the federal definition of trafficking, which is really high. And I actually think that as high as that number was, I think that's a low number, because I think a lot of kids were just not ready to tell us that.
Thank you, Jane. Sex trafficking and prostitution are in the news. They're the subjects of commercial films. They're in the front pages of our tabloids. there's a lot out there about trafficking, sex trafficking in particular. How much of what's out there is myth? Are there major myths about trafficking that are being promoted? And trafficking, thinking about trafficking as we see it nationally and here in our city, and if so, what are they? And I'd like to ask any panelist to take on this question. And I don't know who would like to, I see Jane nodding her head.
Should I start? Okay.
Please.
Okay. So to me, I think one of the biggest myths is what force looks like. You know, part of the definition for trafficking, if you're over the age of 18 or any age in New York, unfortunately, is that you have to prove some sort of force, fraud, or coercion. And I think because of what we see on the media and TV shows and books, people are expecting young girls who are locked in cages and not able to get out. And I think while that happens occasionally, it's much more complicated than that. We've all worked with clients that are traumatically bonded with their pimp. So on one hand, they fear of the pimp, but on another hand, they love the pimp. And if you ask them directly, they're gonna tell you that the pimp is wonderful. And I'll just tell a real quick story why I so immediately wanted to jump at that is that recently I was on vacation. It had nothing to do with work. I was in Thailand. And I said, college roommates were in Thailand on business and invited me to come over. And I was like, I am not going to think about human trafficking this entire trip. I'm on vacation. And I saw, I think it was like a 13-year-old boy, you know, from Thailand with a man in his 50s, waiting for a car to pick them up. And I'm trying to be like, all right, I'm on vacation. There's got to be a good logical explanation for what I'm seeing. Like maybe he's a social worker, maybe he's a friend of the family. I'm like, and I said to my friends, I'm like, this doesn't feel right. Should I do something? And they just looked at me and they're like, he doesn't look forced. He looks really happy. And these were like my friends who have had this conversation with many times and are educated. If someone is not screaming for help or locked up, they don't see victim there.
Lauren.
Well, I think that I can tell you my own personal experience. Before I worked at Equality Now, I was a prosecutor. And when I first started doing this work, I thought that the vast majority of victims that I was going to see were foreign-born victims. And I was quite astounded when I started working on these cases to realize that, that the vast majority of the cases that I saw were American-born girls and women, and they were being exploited right here in our city. Another common myth is that trafficking requires movement. And when I was working in Brooklyn, many of the victims were Brooklyn-born and trafficked in Brooklyn.
Carol.
Yeah, and I'll, yes, agreed. I would have said those two answers if I had answered before this. I want to point out that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the federal law that was passed in 2000, which made human trafficking a crime for the first time in the United States, defines anybody who is under 18 years old who is induced to perform a commercial sex act is a victim of human trafficking under federal law. And I think most people don't understand that. You don't have to have come from anywhere or gone anywhere. Any person in the United States under 18 years old in the sex trade is a victim of human trafficking. And I think that part of the definition is the part that ECPAT is always working on trying to, let people know about. Let me just say quickly, and DORCHEN, if you want me to stop, I'll stop. I want to say something about the demand side and the recruitment of people into the sex trade. That there are pimps who are actively seeking young people to recruit into the sex trade. As one of the victims in one of our reports that we talked about put it, they're looking for vulnerable kids. They're looking for kids who don't have anybody taking care of them, kids who had been sexually abused in their home in a private setting are very vulnerable to being recruited. Foster care kids. One of the pimps said, these kids have been raped so many times, it's my job to teach them, they might as well get paid for it. So they're actively looking on the street, shopping malls, places where they can find kids and then start to chat them up and to talk to them about, oh, you're so beautiful, and he has an expensive car, and he's from a family where she had not really been taken care of and loved like children should be taken care of and loved. And there's this recruitment process that goes on, and then eventually she's his. And she, thinks that this is the best deal that she can get in life, and so, goes off with him. And it's that syndrome that becomes very difficult to overcome, because she's 15 years old, she's with a 40-year-old, and she thinks that this is the best deal that she can get in life. And it really just illustrates that there is this cultural practice here that we take advantage of, and that the sex market takes advantage of in the U.S., and that we all have to understand and know about.
Thank you, Carol. Carol, you made the point that commercially sexually exploited children should be defined as trafficked children, and this is how our federal anti-trafficking law defines commercially sexually exploited children. I'd like to turn to Taina, because we so often hear the question, and it's especially often raised by lawyers, like many of those in this room, what is sex trafficking in general? Apart from a definition of sex trafficking as it pertains to children, is there a definition of sex trafficking, and where does it appear? And could you describe it, please?
Sure. So there are many definitions of sex trafficking. As I mentioned before, the Palermo Protocol, which is the UN trafficking international instrument, really provides with the broadest definition, because it really highlights the means through which someone in a position of power can abuse a person in a position of vulnerability. So that is sort of the gift of a definition that we'd like our federal government to adopt. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, our federal legislation, requires force, fraud, coercion, which, as my colleagues are saying, is very, very difficult to prove from a prosecutor's point of view, because the force may have occurred during the seasoning period. If you're an international victim at the time, let's say you come to New York for that job they promised you from the Ukraine or from Asia to be a restaurant hostess or a babysitter, disappears, and instead you are in debt, you are raped, you are threatened or directly, or there's this threat of harming either you or your family, and other means through which profiteers, traffickers, pimps maintain their victim in the sex trade, so that when the brothel gets raided 3 months, a year, maybe 2 years down the line, there is no force, and we see these patterns in other symptoms of violence against women, such as domestic violence. And these are the kind of the same arguments that we heard when we were also struggling to get comprehensive laws to combat domestic violence. Well, why didn't she leave? Or she should have ironed his shirt better, or served him his food quicker. So it is within that context that we need to look at the definition of sex trafficking. The New York State law has a broad definition. It probably is the best sex trafficking definition in the country, and because it lists the means through which pimps and traffickers maintain their victims in servitude, in sexual servitude. But can I talk a little bit about the myths in addition to?
Absolutely.
So I think Lauren, Carolyn, and Jane gave the major myths. So there's no movement, force is not required, sex trafficking is not necessarily slavery, but there's also these myths are maintained by language, and we need to be very careful about language, right? Every movement has had to deal with sort of the evolution of language, from the African American experiences to the disability environment. And so when it comes to sex trafficking, and when it comes to sort of the way the media and general, not just the press, but also advertising and television and Hollywood and all that, convey the whole concept of exploitation in the sex trade, leads us to make the situation very mundane, right? So we use the word child prostitute. New York Times and Company uses it all the time, when actually these are commercially sexually trafficked individuals if you're under 18. By law, sex worker is also a term that unfortunately is increasingly used by mainstream media to determine prostituted people. It is a term that is used primarily initially by the sex industry to normalize and mainstream exploitation in the sex trade. Again, the term prostitute is also problematic, and our movement is failing, I guess, in a way in drafting language. That's why we need to broaden the movement and bring in all the wordsmiths and the creative people to really show the exploitation and the violence and the discrimination that is part of the sex trade. So this is a conversation to be had. How can we define the prostituted people? And I'm sure DORCHEN may raise too that prostitute is the only word in the New York Penal Code that actually defines the person who is being criminally liable. You don't say murderer, you don't say robber. So why would we say prostitute?
I'd like to push the envelope for just a moment. And I see Brett Figlovsky in the audience, and he wrote a very important article in the Lawyer's Manual on Human Trafficking. And it's a lawyer that's an article that's very much in sync with an Eighth Circuit decision. And the Eighth Circuit said that under certain circumstances, buyers should be considered as traffickers under our federal anti-trafficking law. And I just want to quickly raise this question. Under certain circumstances, would we identify buyers, perhaps buyers of survival sex, as traffickers? Carol, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I'm one of the non-lawyers here, although I do, there has been legislation perhaps introduced, I'm not sure, in federal legislation that would ensure that in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that the definition is clear that the trafficker extends to the buyers of commercial sex, which is something that ECPAT supports, because it really is the demand side, I think as Lauren said earlier, that sets up the whole scheme to take place. And that buyers of commercial sex from children should be seen as criminals to the same extent that traffickers should be.
And Carol, what about the Super Bowl? There's been a lot of debate out there about whether or not there is a connection between the Super Bowl and sex trafficking. I'm just, first of all, what kind of work has happened? Was ECPAT involved in work around the Super Bowl in terms of educating the public about trafficking?
Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit about the work that ECPAT did around the Super Bowl?
So just to lay the groundwork, there's been a huge debate because of the lack of rigorous statistics measuring the size of the trafficking problem, well, generally, anywhere at any time, and also around whether trafficking increases during the time of a major event like a sporting event like the Super Bowl or political convention or others. And so that debate rages. That said, ECPAT did a lot of work around raising awareness and training, especially in the travel industry, in these past several months in preparation for the Super Bowl. And I'll say something about that, but I want to say that the big focus on training and awareness raising around the Super Bowl, I think, is a good thing, because the awareness doesn't go away after the Super Bowl event is over. You now have a well-informed well-trained body of people in a specific geographic location, which carries out the work that ECPAT feels is really necessary for people to know that kids in the sex trade are victims who are entitled to protection, that we need to put in place services for. The buyers and the pimps have to be prosecuted and fully prosecuted, and punished. I'm one of the people who comes down on the side of thinking, well, it's a good thing to put a big focus on the Super Bowl because it will, in the long run, have, I think, a protective effect for children in the future. And let me talk about the travel industry. My organization has created a code of conduct for the travel industry in which companies agree to take 6 voluntary steps to put in place processes to protect children from being exploited on their premises, on their flight, or on their tour. It's called The Code. Thecode.org is the website, or you can look at our website. It's an international code. It's been signed by hundreds of companies around the world, and we've been promoting it a lot in the United States and carrying out training a lot in the United States. In the U.S., it took a very long time for U.S. companies to be willing to sign up, but I can proudly say that now some very big companies like Delta Airlines and Hilton have signed the code, and Wyndham, and a company that manages a number of properties here in New York City. And so in preparation around this, back to the Super Bowl, in preparation for the Super Bowl, we did several trainings specifically aimed at people in the travel industry, both in New Jersey and in New York City. And the mayor of Jersey City insisted that every hotel in Jersey City had to be trained, and God damn it, every hotel from from Jersey City came to our training, got a little certificate afterwards. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
DORCHEN, can I?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I just wanted to direct a question to you for one moment, Lauren. And many people in the audience may have read an editorial in Sunday's New York Times suggesting that there is not a link between major events, major sporting events, and sex trafficking. And I'm wondering about your views, your perspective at Equality Now. And the article also suggested that perhaps in focusing on the Super Bowl and seeing a sex trafficking connection, law enforcement is actually doing more harm than good. What are your thoughts?
So I'll take the first part first, and you might need to remind me what the second part of the question is. But I think, well, we can just look in the news today, for example. Today there was some information that came, I saw breaking news from CNN that there were 45 trafficking-related arrests that were connected to Super Bowl. And we also know that a 15-year-old girl was brought to this area by her mother to sell her for sex. So we know that there is a clear link between trafficking and the Super Bowl. As Carol correctly mentions, we don't have specific statistics on this. It's such a hard thing to actually have statistics on. But common sense would tell you, I think, that just, initially I spoke about supply and demand, where you have a large sporting event where there are many, many men who are coming for entertainment purposes, there's going to be an increase in demand. And when there's an increase in demand, traffickers understand that there is a perfect opportunity for supply. And so while we can't say statistically that there is an increase, we know anecdotally, and I think we can put the pieces together to say that around major events, we need to be cognizant, we need to raise awareness, and law enforcement should be out there and really addressing this issue.
So law enforcement should be out there.
Mm-hmm.
How should law enforcement be out there?
So I'm a big believer that law enforcement should be arresting traffickers and buyers and not people in prostitution. I think we've actually seen a tremendous improvement in the work that NYPD has done in the last several years. I mean, I think that most of us on the panel would agree that there has been a tremendous shift, and there has been a creation of a trafficking unit by NYPD. It's spearheaded by Inspector Anthony Favali, who's really fantastic, who understands the issue, understands the complexity of the issue, and has done really excellent work. We know that people in prostitution are being arrested, and we obviously, we don't want that to be the case, but we also know that this trafficking unit is screening very seriously for trafficking cases, and with the creation of the new court part, the prostitution diversion court parts, citywide, which I think DORCHEN, you'll probably speak about in a bit, we are doing a much better job of providing comprehensive services and exit strategies for people in prostitution and identifying trafficking cases.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I'd like to pause now. I'd like to pose one last question to our speakers and then turn to questions and comments from members of the audience. And so for each speaker, in 1 or 2 sentences, what is the best way to prevent trafficking in our own backyards? And I don't know, Taina, would you like to start with that?
I think as Lauren just highlighted, I think it's really critical, 1, to have strong laws, 2, to train law enforcement, and also using, I think, our allies in the media, in communications, to really make people understand that, 1, the sex trade is the end goal of sex trafficking, so one would not exist without the other, and that prostitution is not an exception to violence against women.
Jane.
I think I'm not going to answer the best way, because I think we've already discussed a lot of the best ways, focusing on demand and law enforcement, but I'm going to just mention something that I think should also be added to the mix.
Thanks.
And that's looking at the supply side. One of the things that the study that we did at Covenant House found was that there was a huge connection between homelessness. At Covenant House, we were unfortunately turning away, due to lack of capacity, close to somewhere between 200 and 400 young people a month. And we're the largest homeless shelter for youth this age in the city. So when we're turning them away, there are no other shelters for them to go. And the pimps know that. The pimps say, I know I only have 2 seconds, but the pimps say, you know, the shelters are full. Where are you going to go? Why don't you come with me? I'd like to take that line away from the pimps.
Thank you. Carol.
I think one of the things that ECPAT wants to focus on is the need for teens and young people to be well educated about the issue and to become activists around the issue. I would really love to see young people standing up and saying, this has got to stop happening to us. This is unjust. This should not be. It shouldn't be that any kid needs to exchange sex with somebody for a place to sleep tonight in the United States. That's just unjust. And what I think we need to do is for every kid to know about the issue and to be trained in activism to know how to put an end to it.
Lauren.
I love that. And I was actually going to say something very similar. We've been doing a lot of work with teens, and I've been really blown away by the activism of teens. But we need to actually start not only speaking to girls, but we need to start speaking to boys and having them understand that buying sex is not a rite of passage or a boys will be boys. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen.
Yes. And I think I'll answer my own question. And I think it involves listening to the voices of survivors. And Lauren, I know that you made an incredible video with the help of McCann Worldwide, and I wondered if we could just play that for one. I think it's pretty short,
Yep.
And then we will have questions and answers and comments.
So just to plug McCann for just a moment, a couple of weeks ago, this issue of trafficking came to their attention, and in about I don't know, 30 seconds, they said to us, we're going to create a campaign. And so they created Not So Super, which is their hashtag, notsosuper.org, this amazing video and lots of things that they're incredibly creative. I'm going to play the video, and they worked just remarkably well with the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition. So I hope you enjoy.
The worst time of the year for any girl. In his calendar, pimps marked down the days of the sporting events.
En la noche de los partidos no importaba en qué lugar era el partido, en otra ciudad podría ser, pero esas noches siempre había más trabajo, puesto que en las casas habían más hombres viendo el partido.
You're forced to go to parties where you're alone with 6 or 7 men who are drunk out of their mind and excited about the big game, but also excited about sleeping with girls. I would say that very few girls who are working major sporting events choose to be involved in the life. The average John does not really want to know that a girl is being trafficked.
Every single one of them could tell by my body language that I didn't want to be there. They saw that I was scared. They saw that I was hiding in the corners of their rooms. They saw that I wasn't making eye contact. You know, that I was cringing and keeping my eyes closed. They just went ahead with whatever they had to go ahead with.
On an average day, my quota would probably be like 2,400, 2,500. On a sporting event day, your quota would probably be doubled. They're not going to come and get you until they know that you've made as most amount of money as you can make. I wouldn't get to keep $1 of the money. My trafficker would keep all of it.
Tickets podría ser como 20, podría llegar a ser hasta 50 tickets, 50.
If you don't make that quota, they will end up beating you to the point where you're in the hospital. I had a guy, didn't make enough money at a major event, and he broke my jaw. If your team wins, they're going to be celebrating into the next day, so you'll be working until like 7, 8 the next morning. Right when the game ends, then your phone just starts ringing and ringing and ringing and ringing non-stop.
I think if men and people really started to see the human faces of someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend, someone's cousin who's being forced to do this, I think we would get a lot more movement in dealing with this issue the way we should.
It can happen to anybody. They go after all kind of girls because John's like variety. You know, and I believe that what he was saying, that was true, that he did own me, that he had a right to do what he was doing, and somehow I deserved it.
If no one participated and purchased sex,
If there was no demand for commercial sex,
No man willing to buy a woman's body as a commodity.
there would be no sex slavery.
Be no women sold.
we need to cut the demand.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And I think we have a little bit of time, about 10 minutes for questions, comments. Yes, I think there's a question there in the back. And I wish we had a mic. And is there any, I guess we can't attach these.
Yes, we can.
Can we?
No.
Would,
Maybe if people come up.
yeah, would it be possible to come up? And
It's going to take time.
might be otherwise a little bit difficult to hear. Thank you. That's,
Okay, well, now I'm really nervous. But my question is about ending demand. So I'm really happy you brought up vulnerability. Almost everyone on the panel did. And it's talked about similarities with gender-based violence and domestic violence. But I'm wondering how this anti-trafficking movement and anti-trafficking legislation can be kind of analogous to the war on drugs, and how what you're calling pimps and johns experience the same vulnerabilities that many of the trafficked young people do. And how are media campaigns different from what we can be doing to, as one from Covenant House said, maybe restoring safety nets or ending homelessness?
Dorch, you want
Would
to
you
answer?
like to?
No, you answer.
pardon? And I think would like to just rephrase. Lauren, would you like to perhaps rephrase the question and focus it? The question was, how is this movement analogous to the war on drugs? And I think the question was, what can we do to better address some of the root causes? Is that, yes, she's nodding. Okay, now I understand the focus of the question.
So, that's a really interesting question. It's funny because I think this is a bit different than the war on drugs, and I'll tell you why. I had, and I say this a bit facetiously, but the distinct privilege of sitting down with a pimp at one point who told me that, that he used to be in the business of selling drugs, but now he's in the business of selling girls. And the reason that he's in the business of selling girls is because with a drug, you sell it and it's gone. But with a girl, she's a reusable commodity. That was his phrase. So I think we actually need to deal with this a bit differently. I think we do need to get to the root causes. And I understand that our jails are, filled to capacity, and I understand that, we should be thinking of other alternatives. But I also think that we should be, I'm a prosecutor at heart, we should be going after criminals, and the real criminals here are the traffickers and the sex buyers.
I think the question may be based in this. And I completely understand it. The criminal justice system has been doing it so wrong for so long. Is there any possibility that the criminal justice system could begin to get it right on this issue? That it's a big, big challenge, isn't it? Because the criminal justice system has been focused on arresting and prosecuting the victims and ignoring the perpetrators. It's a huge challenge for us. It's a huge challenge for us who are engaged with the criminal justice system in any way. And I don't know, Taina, what are your thoughts? Because I know that you're working internationally as well as domestically. Are there criminal justice systems that are getting it right?
Yes, I think as we mentioned before, there are a set of laws that are called the Nordic model, which started with Sweden, again, that penalizes only the buyers of sex. But if I understood your question correctly, were you concerned about the criminalization of pimps and traffickers as opposed to their rehabilitation? That's the way I understood your question.
Yeah, well, I think I understand what the Nordic model is, and there's varying evaluations of it about whether or not it's actually effective. I think it's really interesting looking at the Covenant report saying that so many people who you're calling traffickers are intimate partners and family members of these young people. That's just one study. But who are these traffickers? How should they be handled besides just locking them up?
Yeah, so I think, and DORCHEN is the domestic violence expert, so I'm sure she has a lot more sense about the answer than I do, but it's a conversation that the community has had with batterers in domestic violence, particularly given that the justice system or people were concerned that the overwhelming number of batterers came from communities of color and therefore would be more prone to being incarcerated or criminalized. And there is this thing called responsibility, and as important as it is to go to the root causes, to work with prevention, to engage women and men and boys in this struggle, it's also very important to protect those who are harmed and those who are abused because of their gender. And as an African American woman, obviously, I fully understand the disaster that is our criminal justice system, but we also need to, our responsibilities here at this table is really to make sure that the violence ends and that people are held accountable for the violence.
Yes, there's a question in the back.
I'm a former prosecutor in domestic violence, and I know the domestic violence movement, a lot of it is also just getting everyday people involved. You know, we have lawyers and advocates, but just people, everyday people on the street, just, you know, bearing witness to domestic violence, stopping and saying, I want to do something about this. When it comes to human trafficking, how are everyday people being trained or how are they being educated as to the signs of human trafficking? What would you recommend for them stepping in? And, you know, because once you get everybody involved, whether if you see something, say something, or with bell out, we ring the bell to help stop the domestic violence or the distraction. What examples would you give of that in human trafficking, and what can we do as regular everyday people to help stop it?
Yeah. It's a really good question. I mean, with domestic violence, we often talk about a coordinated community response and really doing intensive public education and outreach. And should we be doing something similar in respect to human trafficking, and are we? And Jane?
I mean, I think there's a whole host of things that there are public awareness campaigns. I mean, Taina mentioned starting with the language. You know, getting people to stop using the words prostitute, particularly child prostitute. It's hard. I don't think you want people to really step in the middle of a trafficking situation, but you want people to be educated. And I believe that there's pretty much most of our organizations do have public awareness campaigns out there. I think it's really also important for people to get involved in advocacy efforts. You don't have too much time to go into too many of them, but here in New York State, there's still a lot of work to be done in the trafficking arena. The New York State definition requires force, fraud, and coercion, even if you're under 18. So we need people to get involved on all sorts of levels.
Thanks, Jane. Another question in the back.
Well, I just wonder why those are the only two options. Why? I mean, maybe they can be released to a safe home or a place where they can be given the services and the social services that they need. Because I agree with you, neither the option that you mentioned sounds particularly good.
But in the absence of those, and I'm not an expert, and I've never handled cases like that myself, but without something like that, if those are the two options, I'm curious to know what you think the better option would be under the circumstances.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing to, and we're really talking about options for commercially sexually exploited youth, child trafficking victims, and I don't know if folks in the room are aware of the fact that and I want to say 2008, New York State passed safe harbor legislation intended to ensure that all commercially sexually exploited children are treated like victims and not as perpetrators, not as juvenile delinquents or, heaven forbid, criminal defendants. And the law was only partially successful. It ended up addressing the needs of those who were 15 and younger, whose cases were being heard in family court, and in fact was successful in ensuring that many, if not most, of these kids got services and were not held in juvenile jails. And in the last week of January, our governor signed into law what we call Safe Harbor 2 to ensure that young people ages 16 and 17 similarly are provided with services, and that no young person emerges with a criminal conviction of prostitution, which can be permanently stigmatizing and an obstacle to legitimate employment. So that's the environment that we're operating in. And I think that Carol and Lauren would like to make points.
Okay. That dichotomy that you present really is the rock and the hard place that those of us who work specifically on child sexual exploitation have been confronting for the last 10 years or so. Oh, well, I really don't think she belongs in jail, but if I release her, she'll go back to the pimp. And so we've been really trying to lead a national movement that addresses both sides of those by advocating both for safe harbor type legislation and not seeing all of these kids as just criminals because they broke the prostitution laws, but also developing series of shelters and different ways of protecting kids. So there is a movement around, creating shelters specifically for sexually exploited kids. Since those are expensive, there's a movement around creating specialized foster care, which New York has started to develop as well, with specially trained foster care parents specifically for those kids. So it has been difficult, no question about it, because we started from nothing, but we're making progress. When you do this for 23 years, you actually see progress with both trying to shift the paradigm over those kids are not criminals, they are victims, and then trying to develop at the same time a place for them. It's been hard, but frankly, public awareness has contributed to elected officials being more willing to pass safe harbor laws and to appropriate funding and to start to move us in that direction.
Thank you, Carol. Lauren.
I'll be brief, but I think there are a few really excellent residential facilities for trafficked kids. There's somebody here from JCCA. Gateways in Westchester runs a great program. GEMS runs a program, a residential facility, and we're seeing that when these teens are in an environment where there are comprehensive services and they're given love and they're given tools to succeed in life, then there is tremendous success.
And I know that there's a campaign now to persuade our government in New York State to commit $10 million to services for trafficked youth. That means shelter, it means trauma-informed counseling, and we really need your help in getting the message to your legislator and to the governor that commercially sexually exploited kids in New York State need a lot of help, and at a minimum 10 million. That actually seems like a drop in the bucket considering the tremendous harm. I think we'll close now, and I just wanted to go back and address the question of, because I think the domestic violence trafficking link is something that hasn't really been discussed on this panel, and it's a really important one. When we look at traffickers and pimps, and we look at sex trafficking, whether it's international or domestic, so much of it is an acute form of domestic violence. Traffickers, pimps get their hooks into their victims by offering love and protection and develop intimate partner relationships with them. And the traumatic bonding that I believe Jane referred to is the kind of traumatic bonding that occurs in an intimate partner relationship when you look at your tormentor as your protector. And traffickers and pimps are very good, and pimps are really a form of trafficker, are very good at inducing that condition in their victims. And so we see victims testifying on behalf of their traffickers. I don't know that I hold out a lot of hope for the reform of pimps and traffickers, because they are in it so deep, and they traffic victim after victim after victim. They use young women up, destroy their lives, and they move on to new prey. And I think the criminal justice response has to be a key part of the solution. The big problem with the criminal justice response, in my view, is that it has been exclusively focused on arresting people in prostitution, which is clearly counterproductive, and ignoring the real perpetrators. But I think the criminal justice system, whether we're talking about police or prosecutors, are getting the message now that they need to do it differently. I'd like to express my gratitude to the City Bar, to the Task Force for Women in the Courts Committee, and to our amazing and knowledgeable panelists, and to so many of you in the audience for being here tonight and really bringing your concern and interest in this issue to the fore. So please join me in thanking our panelists.